Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's August 2024, and I'm going to talk today about both some economic theory and also about current developments or possible developments in China. What I'm worried about in China is that if mistakes are made, then it's could act as a very deflationary force in the world economy in the next few years. But what I'm going to do to start off with is talk about something that goes back almost 100 years, goes back in fact to the American Great Depression. And I'm going to discuss something called the debt-deflation theory of Great Depressions. Now, this idea was put forward by somebody called Irving Fisher, possibly America's greatest economist, who flourished and then didn't flourish in the first half of the 20th century. He wrote an article for the journal Econometrica in 1933 with this title of the debt-deflation theory of Great Depressions. And of course, 1933 was a really awful year for the American economy because it was at the very end of a 4-year collapse in economic activity. Irving Fisher himself had been a very influential economist and also a successful businessman. And in 1929, he was extremely rich with a fortune in terms of today's money into the many tens of millions of dollars. He lost a lot. And I suppose he was spending much less money in 1933 than he was in 1929. And so were other people. So that industrial production halved, unemployment rose to 25%. It was a catastrophe. At the start of this appalling sequence of events, Fisher had been fairly sanguine about the prospects of the American economy. The American economy, the American stock market fell heavily in 1929, but he wasn't worried about that. He thought there'd be a return to what he regarded as normality, which was never-ending prosperity. And so he didn't move into cash quickly enough, and he lost all his money. And 1933, this article of his was about how a sequence of events, dreadful events of this sort, might happen. Now, he started off with assuming a situation in which people had been overconfident, perhaps got some brilliant new idea and wanted to commercialize it. And so they borrowed. And as in 1929, the level of indebtedness was very high compared with the past 10 or 30 years. And so debt's very high. People decide to be cautious. The stock market's just fallen very sharply. It's October 1929. So they repay some bank loans. Now, the effect of repaying the bank loans is to reduce the size of banks' balance sheets. And that means on the liability side of the balance sheet that there are fewer deposit liabilities, less money. You know, when I repay a loan, I have so much money in my deposit and I use that to repay the loan. The deposit disappears and the loan disappears. And you might say, well, that's all very healthy and good and all the rest of it. But the quantity of money has gone down. Now, Irving Fisher then said that what might happen with the drop in the quantity of money is that the price level goes down, so that the value of the debts may have gone down in nominal terms, but in real terms, because the dollar has swelled in value, as he put it, it's increased in real value, the debts have actually gone up in real terms. And he put forward this idea and suggested that this was really the key to understanding what had gone wrong in the previous 4 years. And so it's this paradox that people seem to be being more careful, more cautious, more responsible, and yet the result was, for the economy as a whole, for everybody taken in together in a mass, was actually to make things worse. At the time there was someone called Andrew Mellon, who had been Secretary of the US Treasury through the Republican administrations of the 1920s, in fact, Treasury Secretary from 1921 to 1932. And given the appalling events of that period, of the last 3 or 4 years of his period, his response was that we should liquidate, liquidate, liquidate. In fact, Fisher used the same word to describe exactly what was going on in this repayment of loans, and clearly implied that doing this was a mistake. One point I'd make here, in terms of my own sort of comment on all this, is that it surprises me that you could actually get so catastrophic an effect on the quantity of money as to make the real value of debts rise in a recession of this sort, although something like this clearly did happen in the early 1930s in the USA, unless you bring in another very important part of the story. What we're interested in is trying to understand what determines the quantity of money, all those bank deposits. The banks have got some capital. Usually it's a very small share of their total business. They might have, at that time, I suppose, equity capital of around about 10% of their liabilities. And then all the loans they've got, they will try and make sure the loans are repaid by demanding collateral worth 25, 50, 100% more than the loans. And then they can be pretty sure that even if the value of the collateral falls a bit when asset prices go down, they've got enough of a cover, enough of a buffer, if you wish, to make sure that the loans are repaid. But suppose you have a fall in the quantity of money of, say, 15, 20%, that pushes down some asset prices by more like 30, 40, 50%, and American farmland in this period did collapse in value, then that means that even if, suppose the value of land goes down by 50%, even at the start, the banks demanded collateral twice the value of the loans. At that point, when it's gone down, it's halved in value, they've got no protection at all, and if they go down further, the loan can't be repaid. That then means the banks have got loan losses that bite into their capital. The capital was, say, 10% of the total balance sheet. Capital is then halved. In order to maintain the capital to asset and liability ratio the same, the banks must shrink the balance sheet too. And so this problem of the banking system being highly leveraged works in the same direction as the debt deflation story told by Irving Fisher, and then you really can get something as horrific as the American Great Depression. Okay, so I think I've given you some ideas, thrown some ideas about how the American Great Depression happened. Why am I talking about China? Let's just be clear, by the way, that what happened in the 1930s in the USA was quite exceptional. This is a chart that I used in my last presentation to you a month ago. The early 1930s was the only period in American 20th century history when the quantity of money was falling year by year. That was the only period. I think what we want to then ask ourselves is, how should we deal with something of this sort? And the answer, in my view, is relatively simple, which is that the state, the government working with the central bank, must just create money on a very large scale to offset what's happening to the banking system's capital and the shrinkage of the risk assets that the banks have got, the shrinkage due to the loan repayments, fall in the quantity of money, fall in asset prices, and then this kicking back through this dreadful process into banking system capital, then further shrinkage of capital, a balance sheet, and so on. Quantity of money collapses. In fact, in the US Great Depression, the quantity of money went down by 38%, and that was the background to the halving of industrial production and the rise in unemployment to 25%. The way to stop that is for the government and central bank to work together to create money on a very large scale. They simply have to replace the private sector by borrowing from the banking system themselves, and that in fact is basically what quantitative easing is. That's exactly what the meaning of QE is. Okay, so we've got these two very worthy, famous Americans. One says liquidate, liquidate, liquidate. The other says we want reflation, meaning monetary inflation, and stabilization, meaning price stabilization. Let's get prices back up to where they were before, back up, and keep them at a stable level. I'm, of course, very much in favor of Irving Fisher's position in all this. Okay, now you wonder, how has this got anything to do with modern China? The answer is that in the last few months, money growth in China has been very low and falling sharply. What appears to be going on, and it's difficult to tell, I'm not a China specialist, is that the banks have got some losses on their loans, rather as banks had losses, say, in America in 1929 and 1930. And they've decided, well, is it they or is it the Chinese authorities that have decided this? They must not grow their balance sheets for the moment. So you can see that money growth, having been up in double digits in China for most of the last 30 or 40 years, is now down to about 5% in the last year, and has been, hardly moving at all in recent months. It appears that some Chinese banks have got claims on Chinese local government. Local government is extraordinarily important in China to the economy in various ways. The local governments virtually are in effect bust. And so what's possible is that there's been an edict from on high, from ultimately the Communist Party and the top people in the Communist Party, that the banks must stop growing. I don't know exactly what's going on. There clearly is a very sharp slowdown in Chinese money growth, which we must watch. The difficulty here is that people often get very moralistic. The kind of thing that Andrew Mellon was saying in the early 1930s in the USA appeared to be the morally right reaction. We've had a great time. We've had a time of rapidly rising share price in the 1920s. We've all had a fantastic. Now we must be more appropriate, more moral, more strict. We must cut back. And that's exactly what leads to things like the American Great Depression. I don't know what's going to happen in China. Clearly, the big boom of the last 30, 40 years is over. In that boom, tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people moved from the Chinese countryside to Chinese towns. They have come to live in big tower blocks. These tower blocks are privately owned, in many cases, sometimes owned by local government. And the value of these buildings in this long, long boom soared to ridiculous levels. As the value of the houses returns to something more sensible, there'll be asset price deflation, and that may then feed back into bank balance sheets so that the banks stop growing, start to shrink, and so on. China is today by far the world's biggest exporter of goods. I think last year it exported about $3.4 trillion worth, $3,400 billion worth of goods, compared with $2 trillion from the USA. If you include services, it's much more even, but in terms of goods, China is much more important than any other nation. So the possibility of debt deflation in China would be very important to the world economy in 2025 and 2026 if that is what happens. I'm not an expert on China. I don't think, if you ask me exactly what will it happen, I'd probably say probably not, but we just need to be aware of this sort of possible catastrophic outcome and watch for it, because it'd be a major deflationary force in the world economy. Thank you.